Hello, everybody. Happy Independence Day. It's Thursday, July the 4th, 2024, but not all is well, according to many Americans, about American democracy, the state of the republic. Some people believe, indeed, it's not Joe Biden or Donald Trump that's the problem. We, the people, have become the problem, at least according to my guest today, Diana McClain Smith, who has a new book out, Remaking the Space Between Us. Diana, who is normally based in Boston, is joining us from Long Island. Diana, happy Independence Day. What's gone wrong in America? What's your analysis of the current mood of the country on this particular July 4th?
Well, it's a particularly troubling July 4th, but it is not new. We have a history of moments in time throughout the course of our time together where we have been at great odds. Even during colonial times, there was a moment in time when many people lost confidence in Washington and the Continental Army and no longer supported our effort to break free of England and declare our independence. And that's when Thomas Paine wrote the very famous The American Crisis, where he acknowledged that these are times that try men's souls and that people were divided. And he beseeched and appealed to people not to give up on the country despite the fact that things were not going well. And you fast forward a few decades and you come up to the early 1800s prior to the Civil War, and obviously there was great dispute over slavery. And Southerners and Northerners, and some people also in the North, not just along the geographic divide, but people who benefited from slavery and had an abiding interest in it, and those who thought it was a moral aberration, were very much at odds with one another. And it ended in a civil war. And then after the Civil War, as you well know, you had the Jim Crow era, and you had the Gilded Age, and then you had Teddy Roosevelt come into office, and the Progressive era began. And then you had FDR, and a lot of people didn't like FDR, but they ended up embracing him and his work. And then you had the 60s, another time of division and a lot of social unrest, a lot of political unrest. And then it quieted down for a while, and everybody thought democracy won. It was the end of history. And we discovered that that's not true. And we're in another era in the face of many global changes, not just the pandemic, but global changes that have been in place now for 50 to 70 years. And people are feeling anxious and they're feeling uncertain. And what do people do when they're feeling anxious and uncertain? They go to people who are like them. They become more insular. They go to their own groups and they become very closed-minded. And then they become more distant from groups that are different from them. And that then begins to develop a dynamic where
I take this narrative, Diana, but...
excuse me. I was almost finished. Could I just finish?
Well, let me jump in. We've had our history lesson from you. You present it as if anxiety and uncertainty are unnatural, but isn't that the case of the history of any country and the history of the world? There's always anxiety and uncertainty. There are always divisions. There are always problems. What's unusual and unnatural about that?
Did I say it was unnatural? I don't.
Well, you implied that it's a problem that Americans were divided about slavery and about this and that, and it separated them, and then they somehow came together. But isn't disagreement normal? Isn't that how we operate as a society, whether it's America or
I'm sorry, I don't recognize that characterization. I said at different periods of time throughout our nation, there are rising moments of more fundamental disagreement. And there are moments in time over the course of history throughout the world where change is more fundamental and it's happening more rapidly. And that's happened in the last 50 years. And so it's not just a matter of disagreement. It's a matter of fundamentally differing over values and beliefs. And the conflict becomes quite personal and quite emotional. That is not something that happens all the time. That ebbs and flows, and it's ebbed and flowed throughout our history.
Was there a moment then, reversing this, where America was united, where you didn't have these divisions, or a time where you can look back and think, I wish we were still like that?
I don't think it's a matter of I wish we were still like that because the history was so different. But yes, there have been times when we were very united. Oftentimes, it's when there's an external threat around which we unite. World War II would be a very good example. But prior to World War II, we weren't united as to whether or not we ought to get involved. Pearl Harbor put an end to that disagreement. There have been times like that where we have come together. And I would imagine, you would, in the 90s, 80s and 90s, many people thought democracy was victorious and the Soviet Union was disbanding and we were going to be the dominant force in the world. And I think people got behind that.
Although we've done shows, we did a show a couple of weeks ago in the 90s where we've done actually a couple of shows on the 90s, which reminded us that this was the beginning of a new kind of Ku Klux Klan, a beginning of right-wing terrorism. So even the 90s wasn't quite as halcyon as some of us might like to remember. What about...
No, excuse me. The 90s was certainly not halcyon, but it was underneath the surface. That was the very beginning of when inequity started to rub people the wrong way and the animosity towards elites began to grow. But there was not, in fact, hate groups multiplied during the 90s, but there still wasn't the kind of open disagreement broadly in the populace that you see now.
What about going back almost 300 years to the revolution or the Independence Day situation, the rebellion against the British? Even that was a kind of civil war, though, wasn't it? I mean, not everybody wanted independence. And of course, most of the rebels were, in a sense, British.
Well, no, it wasn't a civil war. Every change that's ever happened in American history has not been led by a majority. The people who fought for independence from Britain, who were activists, were a minority, but they had the support of a larger populace. But there were certainly people there who sided with the British.
Your analysis, I mean, you're not alone. Many people agree, I think, with a rather pessimistic view of America. But you suggest that we shouldn't blame the politicians. The orthodox view is the politicians and the political parties have gone wrong. But you say we, the people, have become the problem. Why is that, Diana? What has happened?
Well, Sarah Longwell, who's the publisher of The Bulwark, you're probably familiar with her work. After January 6th, she identified what she called the Republican Triangle of Doom. And right after January 6th, if you interviewed most Republicans, they would have said that they would have called it an insurrection, they would have said it was wrong, and they would have said the election was not stolen. But then all of a sudden, the media, especially on the right, started to broadcast that it was actually patriots who had taken over the Capitol and the election was stolen. Politicians began to echo that because the people began to echo it. They started to fear losing the support of the people. So they became more vulnerable to exhorting a view that the election was stolen and that January 6th was a bunch of patriots reclaiming our democracy. And it was the interaction of those three elements, the people, the media, and politicians, especially extremist politicians. And anytime you talk to people about why we're in the mess we're in, they will go to the extremists, they will talk about the media, and they'll talk about the politicians, but they won't talk about what More in Common has dubbed the exhausted majority, which are the people who actually didn't believe that, but never spoke up, didn't mobilize at that time. They are now, and that's, to me, very optimistic. I think people are now recognizing that they have a responsibility and a role to play, and they can't cede their power to people who are on the extreme left or the extreme right, or to the media.
Is the problem, Diana, in your view, a problem of the extreme right and left? There seems to be some disagreement. We've had a number of shows about this. Some people see the Republican Party as the problem and the radicals on the right, but others believe that both parties have a responsibility. Is it both left and right in your view? Or is it mostly a problem with the Republican Party? And you mentioned January 6th, of course, which was a Republican Party problem.
You know, my entire life in organizations was spent with people saying who's more at fault, as opposed to in what ways are different parties contributing to the same problem. I don't find who's more responsible a fruitful question. I think the right, if you want to look at it as a quantify, you know, how many on the right are threatening the democratic norms, you could say it's a larger percentage of people. There are people on the far left who exacerbate the dialogue and actually give fodder to people on the right, which you saw after the Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's counterattack. Rather than see that as a centuries-old cycle of violence between the Palestinian extremists, Hamas, and Israeli extremists, they decided to take sides and blame people. And I don't see that as being particularly productive either.
So you're suggesting that the students, for example, who demonstrated against the Israeli invasion of Gaza, that they were wasting their time, that it's an inappropriate thing to do?
Not in the least. What I faulted them for is not understanding that it was a cyclical dynamic, not just the Israelis.
You seem very moderate, Diana, but most people aren't. Are you suggesting that everyone should become moderate, centrist, realistic like yourself? Are you suggesting that we get rid of our passions?
Well, first of all, if anybody ever heard you say that I was getting rid of my passion, they'd laugh. No, I'm not talking. I don't consider myself moderate. I consider myself fair-minded. I consider myself somebody who tries to find a toehold that we can use to alter dynamics that are self-destructive. And we have dynamics in our country right now between the left and the right, between racial groups, between generations, between different groups. We have dynamics that are cyclical and that are tearing apart our nation. And so I'm not trying to suggest that we have the baby. I'm trying to suggest that we each look at our responsibility for destroying this thing we call democracy.
Aren't there real problems here, though? You brought up the generational divide. We did a show on that yesterday with Celeste Marcus, who's very angry with the boomer generation. There are real issues of wealth, for example, when it comes to the differences in generations, issues associated with the national debt, college costs, the medical system. These are not just the citizens' bad attitudes. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes in politics, these profound divisions and even violence are explained for material reasons.
Yeah, I agree. People have different interests, and sometimes those interests are material interests. The question is, are we ever going to get to a point where, rather than seeing it as a zero-sum game, where somebody has to win and somebody has to lose, we start to sit down and try to really understand what people's interests are and start to get creative about options that might advance the interests of both parties. That's a fundamental tenet of people who work in principled negotiation, and they are responsible for absolutely stunning results in mediations among parties that are diametrically opposed over their material interests, including the 2015 Paris Agreement, which was negotiated with 197 countries, and their interests were not aligned. They had to get creative about how they were going to deal with their different interests.
Your day job is at Action design.
No, that's out of date. That's probably
your career anyway has been spent in corporate consulting. Are you treating America as if it's a big corporation?
Well, first of all, I wasn't a consultant to corporations. I was a consultant to organizations in the for-profit and nonprofit sector. I did a lot of my work in the social sector for maybe 30 years.
Okay, well, I take the point.
And so let me say where I think there's a consistency between what I looked at there and what I look at in our nation. Any organization, any system is made up of different groups. And in an organization, those groups exist laterally across the organization, different functions, and they exist hierarchically. You have people who have, who are the bosses and people who work for them. And those groups are often in conflict with one another. And the more conflict you get amongst different divisions and functions, oftentimes the more authoritarian the leaders become. And you're seeing that happen in our country right now. And so I saw an enormous similarity in the dynamics among groups and how they operate. Even if it's a different system, it's still a social and political and cultural system made up of groups that exist laterally and exist hierarchically. And the conflicts that they have get played out in much the same way.
We are speaking with Diane McClain Smith, the author of Remaking the Space Between Us, an appropriate conversation for July 4. I want to thank our friends at Liberties Quarterly, Quarterly of Culture and Politics, to help us bring great guests like Diane McClain Smith. Going to run a short feature on liberties, and then we'll be back to talk about her fix. We've laid out the problem of the divisions, anxieties, uncertainties in American life. How can Americans come together to build a better future? Diane McClain Smith will answer that after a short video break. Don't go away, anyone.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Diane McClain Smith, author of Remaking the Space Between Us. So, Diana, we in the first half of the show, we've laid out the problem. Your analysis is we're too much focused perhaps on our rights, not enough on our responsibilities. How are we going to change ourselves? What would you suggest the best strategies are for remaking the space between Americans? I know you have 4, as these types of books have. They always have some bullets. The first one is start with yourself. How do we start with ourselves?
Well, the one thing we didn't get to in the analysis is this dynamic of us becoming ever more insular within our own groups. And so starting with yourself means starting to re-examine your own assumptions, your own beliefs, your own points of view, your own interests, your own thoughts about how other people in other groups would answer those questions, and start to second guess them and test them to see if they're accurate. I was on a show just recently where somebody said, what you're suggesting is that we reach out to people on the other side, but Democrats never negotiate. They never give an inch. Well, that's an assumption. And it says all Democrats are the same and none of them are going to give an inch. So part of it means to start with what are the assumptions we're making about people who are different from us, and not just ideologically different, but demographically different. And sometimes it's hard to test those things because you don't have access to people in other groups because we're so divided. And that's where I began to do research on organizations that are bringing people together at the local level. And these are organizations that are locally rooted and nationally connected. And there are literally thousands of them. And so on my website and in the book, I call out a number of these where it gives you the opportunity to get to know some of these organizations and and reach out to them. And these are places where you can begin to test some of the assumptions you're making about other people.
Last week, I was at the Braver Angels National Convention in Kenosha. It was there in Wisconsin, situated appropriate enough between Milwaukee and Chicago, where the two-party conventions are this
Great
year.
example.
I'm not sure how much you've looked at Braver Angels, but are they an example of a group, if you know them, that are bringing people together?
Yeah, so I mentioned a number of them in the book. One essay talks about three, and I singled out these three because they are examples of different types of organizations, but there are hundreds of them in each case. Braver Angels would be one that focuses on substantive disagreements that people have across groups along political ideologies, and they create constructive debates. So they have a chair and they ask people to only talk through the chair. They have a bunch of rules that ensure that the debate stays constructive. And people come away from that being very stunned at the reasonableness of the other side and understanding better why they have the views they have. So that would be one example, Braver Angels. A second one is an organization called One Step, which is actually a part of an organization called StoryCorps. And what they do is they're trying to get at what's called the toxic polarization underneath people's differences. And this is where the divisions become more emotional, and we actually don't understand the other person well enough to see them accurately. And we tend to stereotype them and dismiss them and become disdainful. And so they have created opportunities for people, and anyone can get on their website and sign up to have 30-minute conversations with somebody whose life experience is very different from your own. If you're a younger person in their 20s, getting together with a boomer. If you're black, getting together with someone who's white. If you're, down the line of people. But they don't talk about the substance. They structure it so that you really try to understand the person's life experience.
It's like a sort of dating thing, except it's not romantic.
No, it's not romantic. And then the third one is Resetting the Table, which had its origins in the Middle East and then came to the US. And they do longer term work with groups at the local level to try to bring them together and help them understand each other, but also help them work on common problems. And there are a bunch of other organizations, I could go on forever, that are doing extraordinary work and giving people opportunities to get to know people who are on the other side of either an ideological or a demographic divide.
What about the political ramifications? The two parties seem more and more divided and divisive. Some people believe that we need a third party. The Braver Angels seem to suggest that in some ways. Do we need new political organizations, or can we do all this on our own? If we start with ourselves, we'll get to a couple of your other solutions later. But can this be realized through individuals?
No. We absolutely need political reform, and a lot of it, including a winner-take-all two-party system, which contributes to an extraordinary amount of polarization. Lee Drutman's probably written the most intelligently and expansively about this. And the difficulty is that right now it would be very difficult to pass those reforms because the populace itself is so interested in their party prevailing that they would not want to do any reform that would threaten their edge. So I do think it does not end with the people at all, but it sure as hell starts with us.
We've had Lee Drutman actually on the show. You
sure
used the word ideological. For you, is that
I'm sorry?
You used the word ideological.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something that for you is almost unnatural? Is it something we need to purge ourselves of?
Well, when I refer to ideological divides, I'm referring to differences that go to one of people's belief systems and values. So they have different ideologies. How ideological somebody is can be a problem. I mean, if your beliefs have you and you don't have your beliefs, and you can't step back and examine them, that is a problem. But having ideas and beliefs, we all have them. It's a matter of how we hold them. And right now, the more divided we become, as I said before, and the more insular we become, the more people are clinging to these beliefs and not examining them and scrutinizing them in terms of other beliefs, in terms of data that we might all agree is reasonable data. That then becomes the problem.
A lot of the strategy in the book is from below, stuff bubbling up. What about the idea that what America needs are stronger leaders? Maybe not strong leaders like Trump, but certainly stronger leaders than a man like Biden, who in his debate performance last week really disappointed and troubled a lot of people. Is one of the issues in America that strong leaders, the system is not enabling strong leadership to come through, especially younger leaders?
Well, I don't think the system is, and I think we're part of the system. People are part of the system, but I don't think the system is allowing great leaders to emerge. I think the way the parties are run, the way Congress is run, the way we are so divided in our politics at the local level, at state level, is preventing the emergence of leaders who, I mean, and you're saying strong leader. I would say I'm looking for a leader who's capable, visionary, motivating, inspiring, and pragmatic, able to get stuff done. I'm not looking for someone who's going to shove stuff down our throats. So I'm not sure when you refer to strong leader to what you're referring.
Well, everyone but isn't that the point? Does everyone have different? Some people might define a leader as Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. Other might define them as Napoleon or George Washington. I mean, leadership is also, in a sense, ideological.
Of course it is, yes. And I think when people are wanting greater certainty and stability, which does ebb and flow over the course of history, they look for somebody who's going to be more Napoleonic or look at the rise of Hitler and Stalin at a time of great disruption after World War I. That was not the same global reality we had in the last, in the 60s or 70s, as disruptive as those were. And they were disruptive. They were an order of magnitude more disruptive, and they gave birth to a lot of authoritarian leaders. And we see some of that emerging now. I don't consider those strong leaders. I don't.
So who's your model leader? The two who often come up in these kinds of conversations about bringing America back together. The one who comes up most of all is Lincoln, and then of course there's FDR. Are these models of leadership that politicians, contemporary American politicians, should try to emulate?
I would hope they would. I think people think they're a bridge too far. They're out of reach because they're so extraordinary. I don't agree with that. I would put Lincoln and Washington as the two exemplars of extraordinary leadership towards which leaders ought to aspire. And if you ever get a chance to read John Meacham's book, And There Was Light, about Lincoln's rise to power and his nomination prior to the Civil War, what's so extraordinary about it is not just his moral compass, which, by the way, evolved over time. It wasn't like he began, as a staunch abolitionist. He was a pragmatist, and he was a morally grounded person. And he struggled within himself with those two poles. And he had an extraordinary gift with people. He could read the room brilliantly. And he was just an amazing human being. And Washington, similarly, it just inspired the confidence of his men. He understood what they were up against. I mean, he had all his troops read the American crisis the night they crossed the Delaware, because he knew they were outnumbered and he knew they needed motivation. These are exceptional leaders. And the other thing that David McCullough would say about Washington is it did not matter what that man was up against. He just would not quit. Now, I'm looking at what's happening now with Biden, and there is a big question in my mind as to whether or not sometimes, you know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run. It's a tough decision for him, a very tough decision. And
I'm not sure everyone would agree with that. I think some people.
No, not everyone would agree it's a tough decision.
Well, it seems to me at least a fairly obvious decision that he should.
Well, you may think it's obvious. I'm saying a tough decision for him.
Well, if he claims to be what he actually is, which is, an American concerned about the future of the country, but that's another matter. Let's end with a return to history. One of your arguments of bringing people together, remaking the space between us, is paving the way for help. In historical terms, are you talking, and the groups you've covered in this book, are we imagining a kind of new revivalist movement, almost evangelical in its quality?
I wouldn't have said that. What leads you to ask the question?
Sorry?
I said I would not have put it that way. What leads you to ask the question?
Well, paving the way for hope sounds rather evangelical. You quote the Chinese philosopher Lin Yutang, who said, "Hope is like a road in the country where many people walk on it. The road comes into existence." That sounds rather evangelical, revivalist. I mean, America is a country with a strong religious tradition. Do you think that needs to be rethought or reimagined and attached to this bringing the country back together?
I would not have thought of it as evangelical, but I see what you're saying. I think people need hope. I think people are despairing about our ability to move forward as a multi-group democracy. And I don't think that you can manufacture that hope out of nothing. I think people have to begin doing what it is they want to see. So if they want a country that is less divided, then they need to act in ways that will create less division. And once we do that, and we are starting to do that quite a bit, actually, then I think people have reason to hope. And I think people need hope in order to continue to do the work we need to do. Otherwise, why do it? If you don't think it's possible, you just give up.
Diana, finally, some people might be listening or watching and thinking, is this all invented drama? Everyone these days seems to complain about everything, whether it's airlines or healthcare or their own mental condition. America remains an incredibly dynamic, wealthy country. The economy is humming along, certainly compared to almost any other economy. Society pretty much works in America. For all the dramatic warnings about civil war, there doesn't seem much evidence of that at the moment. Can America continue to be a successful society and at the same time be divided?
I don't know. I suspect it's going to be very problematic. Some of the divides go quite deep. It makes it hard to solve very urgent problems. We've got climate change, we have immigration, we have sustaining our economic engine, which is doing well now, but as you know, it goes up and down over the course of history. How are we going to attend to those problems if we are so divided that we can't reach agreement on how to handle them? I just think that's going to be tough.
But you use those two examples, immigration and climate change. People disagree. People disagree about the depth of the problem, and certainly when it comes to immigration. Americans, both left and right, white, black, brown, they're very deeply divided on whether or not immigration is the solution or the problem. So are we ever going to be in a society where everyone agrees on these things?
I don't think so. We'll be in a society where everyone agrees on it, but I don't know if you've had Larry Diamond and James Fishkin.
I've had Diamond.
Okay, well, then you know that he conducted deliberative democracy experiments where the media and extremists were not allowed in the room, and they took up questions, including immigration. They polled them. The group was representative sample, 500 people or more. They polled them at time T1 as they began. Then they deliberated in small groups about immigration as well as other issues. And then they polled them at the end as to their views. And without exception, not without exception, but almost everybody moved more towards a moderate centrist position and away from extreme answers, and reached a lot of consensus on ways they might move forward on immigration. So, it looks like if we have the right conditions, it might be possible for us to reach consensus.
So citizen assembly style reform, so people could get into the same room. I know the Irish Canadians, but the Irish in particular pioneered this in terms of citizen assemblies on abortion, which was a profoundly divisive issue in Ireland.
As it is here. So those experiments were quite provocative, and I talk about them at the beginning of the book because I think they suggest that we're capable of better, and it's a matter of recognizing that and learning from people who are already doing better in our country.
So finally, Diana, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show on this July 4th. Perhaps you might suggest one thing, a practical thing, a thing which wouldn't require too much effort that people might begin to do to remake the space between us, how citizens can actually work together to build a better future for all in the United States.
The one thing I think would help the most is the next time you're with somebody who has a different point of view or comes from a different background, is rather than start by focusing on where you disagree on positions, is don't build a case, build a relationship, and try to get to know the other person. Try to get to know why they see the world the way they do, what their experience in life has been, and most importantly, what they have in common. I have a lot of friends who are far to the right of me, and we share a lot of the same interests and the same values, and that allows us to disagree productively.